to the cloud. Recording in progress. So welcome to those who've come out. This is our fourth session of our Parables of a Palestinian Rabbi course. So we took a break last week to make room for the First Congregational Church Council meeting. And we are back again this week with Divine Economy. We're going to be taking a look at a parable from the Gospel according to Matthew about some vineyards and some laborers. And tonight I am so delighted to welcome my new friend Bert to be with us. He is going to share some of his wisdom. He has been studying the Gospel of Matthew and doing a podcast about some of the things he's learned. And working in the world of social justice and housing justice and peace for a long time now. And so I'm gonna just turn the floor over to him if you'd like to introduce yourself, Bert, and tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're going to be sharing with us tonight.
Sure. Thanks. Well, thank you for having me here. It's great to be with you. I was expecting to see Adriana. She's the one that got me here. So maybe she'll show up.
She may yet.
Yeah. So I do a podcast on the Gospel of Matthew. It's called, the original title was Parody and Subversion in Matthew's Gospel. But now I've added Bible Study, Parody and Subversion in Matthew's Gospel. That's the name of it now. So people have a sense of what it is, even if it's a liberationist. Basically that's what it is, a liberationist approach, reading it from the standpoint of power and with an eye to the ancient context, historically and literarily and culturally. So Tom asked me to do the parable of the workers in the vineyard, which is actually one of my favorite, and it is the next episode of my podcast. I haven't done it yet, so you're going to be helping me. I am right up to that point in the podcast. I'm going through the book, and I am right at the point of doing that. Yeah.
I'm wondering, where are you broadcasting from? Are you local or are you?
I'm in Pasadena.
Oh, Pasadena. Okay.
Yeah. So I don't know if you consider that local or not, but you know,
it's local.
Local enough.
So yeah, Southern California. So, I'm right at this point. So this is going to actually help me write the next episode. So my episodes are usually 15 to 25 minute, just monologue, just me unpacking the text. So, okay, so I've got a PowerPoint. So I'm going to share my screen here.
And before you do that, Bert, maybe give our folks just a couple sentences of context for who you are and what you're bringing to the study of the text.
So I am, outside of being a podcaster, I am also ordained in the Mennonite Church USA. And I was on staff at Pasadena Mennonite Church for 7 years and was an intern before that for a couple of years. And but now I'm what's called a ministry associate, which is an ordained person with ministry out in the community. And my main work right now is affordable housing. So I'm with a faith-based or faith-rooted affordable housing organization that works most of our work is in Pasadena, but we are going beyond that a little bit, and our educational work is across the country. We just did a conference in Durham, North Carolina by Zoom. So that's kind of where I am. I've also been involved with Christian peacemaker teams in the past. Say that because Tom knows who they are. And I've done a lot of different things. So
could you tell us what's the name of the faith-based organization that's in affordable housing?
It's called Making Housing and Community Happen.
Okay.
So if you Google that, there are 3 websites. The .org one is the one for the organization. There's also a .net, which is our blog, and a .com, which is a book that was written by our executive director edited it, and a number of us were authors in the book. But yeah, Making Housing and Community Happen. And I'd love to talk with you about that at some point, and about the work we're doing here. So, yep, there you go.
right. So
Yeah.
you should be able to share screen, Bert. And thank you so much for giving that context. That's,
Sure.
I think, work that's important to a lot of us here at First Church. So
Yeah, I'd definitely love to come back and share more about that from that. Yeah, if yeah, it's the work that we're doing, and definitely, because we do some work beyond Pasadena, and especially educational work to try to help local groups. We're very grassroots, so what we try to do in other areas is try to get grassroots groups going. So anyway, so let me share the screen. Let's get to the topic for tonight. Can you see that?
It hasn't popped up yet. Now it did.
Okay.
Great.
All right.
There we go. There we go.
All right. So from the first. Okay. So, all right. So this is this is not a well-known parable. I don't know how many of y'all were aware of it before tonight. If you read the Gospels, obviously you were, but if you don't, you probably, if you're just sort of aware of the ones that get talked about in church, this one often doesn't. It gets skipped
It's
over.
actually one of my favorites.
Awesome.
I really like this one. Yeah.
Yeah. So so now usually or often, I want to say, it gets interpreted as a metaphor for, I think, for salvation. I think that's sort of a more evangelical approach to it. I'm not going to go in that direction tonight. If somebody wants to talk about it in that direction, maybe at the end of the night, we might have time for it. I'm going to talk about it in a way that takes the actual setting very seriously. And so what I want to do is I want to start out by reading the text. And as we read through the text, I want us all to think about who we identify with in the text and why we identify. And you can identify with more than one character. So why don't we do, I got it all on one screen. Can you see that whole text?
Yes.
Excellent. Pam, why don't you read the first 5 verses?
For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for a denarius for the day, he sent them into his vineyard. When he went out about 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And he said to them, "You also go into the vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. When he went out again about noon and about 3 o'clock, he did the same.
Sarah, can you go from there and read the next 5?
And about 5 o'clock, he went out and found others standing around. And he said to them, "Why are you standing here idle all day?" They said to him, "Because no one has hired us." He said to them, "You also go into the vineyard." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his manager, "Call the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and then going to the first." When those hired about 5 o'clock came, each of them received a denarius.
Can you take it from there?
Sure. When they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. These who were hired last worked only 1 hour. They said, "And you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the work and in the heat of the day." But he answered one of them, "I'm not being unfair to you, friend. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give the one who is hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I am generous?" So the last will be first and the first will be last.
Yeah, great. Wonderful. Thanks. All right. So who do you identify with in this parable, and why do you identify with them? So why don't we start? I'll go backwards, and we'll well, backwards on my screen, which is Bo is the last one. So Bo, why don't you tell us who you identify with in this and why? Or if you don't, maybe you don't identify with anybody, but that's fine. But yeah.
I identify with the landowner. Not that I'm a great landowner, but it is his money, and he can choose to do with it as he pleases. And if he thinks the right thing to, I mean, there can be variables that aren't, you know, there are variables undoubtedly in the story that aren't in the text. I just think it comes down to that. I think it's fair because he's paying the people, and the people who agreed to work all day for denarius, they received what they were, that was the bargain. It wasn't as though they got less because the ones who came later got more, or they got more at all.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So for you, it's a landowner because it is his money and he's being fair.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And he didn't cheat anyone. He was honest with everyone.
He was honest. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Sarah, how about you?
Well, I had trouble trying to identify with anybody, but
Okay.
I think that if I was going to identify at all, I would identify with the ones who felt they were being unfairly treated because they did work a day's worth for the pay that they were told they would get, but then others came along later and got the same pay. I think that's inequitable.
Okay. So you think it wasn't fair. So you're sort
It
of taking
wasn't fair.
okay. So you're taking the opposite position from Bo. Okay.
Yeah. So I would identify with the workers who labored all day and
only
were paid, you know, the same as the ones who labored for an hour. I don't think that was fair.
Right.
But
Pam, how about you?
Yeah, I don't know that I really identify with anyone, although probably the landowner, and it is his money, his decision. He chose to do it. And as Bo said, I mean, the deal was the deal, and he just decided to extend that to other people. I guess he needed the workers. But, you know, part of it is if you look at it from the labor perspective, it really wasn't fair because, as Sarah said, you know, those that worked all day got the same amount for someone who came and worked the last hour. So I have issues with all of it.
Gotcha. Tom, do you want to weigh in? Do you want to say for yourself?
Yeah, I mean, funnily enough, today I actually identify with the laborers who didn't work as long but still got the same pay. And the reason for that is a sense of you know, and whether this is an accurate interpretation of reality or just my own neuroses, sometimes feeling like I didn't actually like work as hard as other people in order to get ahead or to not quite deserving the things I've been given, like that sort of consciousness of, wait, if they got the same pay as I did, maybe I didn't actually deserve this at some level. Maybe I'm just grifting my way along. Yeah, I don't know that that's accurate in my brain, but I certainly feel that sometimes. And tonight I find myself wondering what those guys are thinking.
Yeah. No, I feel you. I sometimes feel very privileged in not having to work as hard as some people are working the job that I love, you know, right? Is that really work? Yeah, and it may not even have occurred to anyone else before Tom said this, that you could identify with that group because they're the most silent, right? That you never actually hear from them. The people that speak are the landowner and the workers that grumbled, right? The workers that got paid more than what you think they were going to get paid, you don't actually hear from. So you may not have even thought maybe that you could identify with them, but but maybe, you know, some of us
They
do.
probably were staying silent because they didn't want to get involved because they
Right,
did
right,
get more,
Yeah.
so to speak.
right.
Yeah, that's the best time to stay silent, when you got the when you're getting the good end of the stick. Yeah.
Yeah.
So well, yeah, that's great. Now let me ask you this. Has anyone here ever hired a day laborer? Raise your hand, or Bo, you can use the you can just say whether you did or not. Or you can use the, I think is there a thing where you can raise a hand? I don't know. But
Yeah, somewhere.
has any of y'all ever hired day laborers? No?
I have.
You have, okay. So there's another way you can identify. If you've hired day laborers, then that's a way for you to identify. I've hired day laborers before. Have you ever offended someone by not paying them the right amount?
No.
Okay, you haven't. Anybody else? Tom, you have?
Maybe. Oh,
I don't know about that, but it occurs to me that I don't hire day laborers in the strict sense, but I hire a lot of people in like the gig economy. Like I hire like task rabbits to come help me move. Like when I moved into my house here, we hired a couple of people on that to come for 2 hours and help us unpack our apartment. So I don't know if that's the exact same thing, but it's similar. That's just what I wanted to add.
Yeah, yeah. Sarah, you were going to say?
I was going to say, I'm very careful when I tip, that I tip maybe more than adequately, because I feel that I can afford that. And I want to make sure that someone has a working wage, you know. But and sometimes if I felt like I've not tipped enough, once I went back, and it was a nail place, and gave the person who did my nails a little bit more, because I realized that I had not given her what I had intended at first. And that made me feel uncomfortable. And so I went back.
Right.
And gave more.
So in there, you're sort of identifying again with the landowner, because you're paying extra for something beyond what was expected.
Maybe.
Okay. And I live near a day laborer center. In fact, we've become involved with the day laborer center in various ways. They do a lot of advocacy for immigrant labor. And so I've actually hired day laborers many times. And I've offended someone by ironically paying them too much. We usually if we feel that people are asking for too little, we pay more. And one time I was rounding up the guy. I don't remember what the amount was. It was like, you know, he asked for $240, and I said, we'll give you $300. And he got really angry. He only wanted the amount he was asking for, and he stopped returning my calls. So yeah, who knew, right? But usually that doesn't happen. Usually people are pretty happy. So, but for me, I immediately, when I read this, my immediate identification is with the landowner, because I've been in that position of actually hiring day laborers. Has anybody here been in a position of being a day laborer? Other than when you were like really young? When we were really young, a lot of us did odd jobs, but as an adult, yeah. I have some friends who are undocumented, and they do day labor. I do have a couple of white US citizen friends who have done it. One, because he's a Catholic worker, and his Catholic worker house serves that population. And so he just did a day of it to find out what it was like. But I had another friend who, white US citizen from an upper middle class family, but came on hard times and actually spent some time homeless. And for money, at one point, he went out and stood where the day laborers stand and got hired for one day, and went out and tried to do it. And by this point, I think he was late 30s, early 40s. So he wasn't conditioned for that. He said it was really hard, and he couldn't get through the day. Kind of interesting. So, all right. So that gets us a little bit into the parable. I want to get into the context, and I want to talk about the ancient context first. So this is about landowners and day laborers. Now, so we were talking, and as we were talking, we're identifying with the different people. We're talking out of our own lives and out of this context. Part of what is the backdrop here is that at this point in the Roman Empire, in the first century Mediterranean world, the elites there was a small group of a part of the population that tended to own most of the land. And the land they owned had at one point belonged to the peasants, the working class. And so that's the situation going on here. So some peasants were still, there are a few peasants that were still able to hold on to their land, others that had become tenant farmers on their land, and others that had become basically landless and were day laborers. That's the group that is in our parable today. They're near the very bottom of the economic ladder. Probably the only people below them are like beggars and people like that. So they are very, very precarious situation. Also, there's this question of Jubilee. Now, we don't know whether the landlord or the landowner, not landlord, the landowner is Jewish or not. In Galilee especially, there were a lot of wealthy Gentiles. So it could be a Gentile landlord. But at this point in Matthew, they're actually in Judea, not in Galilee. There was this ancient law. You're probably familiar with it. You've probably heard of it before, the Jubilee. It was the super Sabbath year every 49 or 50th years that the land was supposed to go back to its original owners. So now this law was not being followed, and a lot of scholars, kind of the thing you hear in the scholarly world is that this was probably never put into practice. However, it was not forgotten. The prophets keep bringing it up. And Jesus, in the Gospel of Luke, brings it up in his inaugural sermon in Luke 4, where he refers to the year of the Lord's favor, which is a reference to Isaiah 61, which the rabbis understood as referring to the year of Jubilee. So, and he says, that's why the Spirit of the Lord is on me. That's why I've come, is for the year of Jubilee. So this was not forgotten, even if it was not being practiced. So that's part of the backdrop here, that the landowner is one of a small group of elite that owns land that probably belonged to the families of the peasants he's hiring. And if he was abiding by the law, which almost no one was, he wouldn't be unique by not abiding, then he probably wouldn't own most of that land. More context, landowner is in the NRSV, which we read, translates it as landowner, but elsewhere in Matthew, it's master of the house, or very literally, it's house despot. So the despot part of that, despotes, implies someone exercising unrestricted power and absolute domination, confessing no limits or restraints. So that's the word being used here. Now, interestingly, it is used of Jesus earlier in the gospel in chapter 10, verse 25. Jesus is called the master of a house or a house despot. And that's the image is of Jesus as the master of a house of wisdom, where his disciples, he and his disciples are a household, and he's the teacher, they're the disciples, and that's a household. And then also Philo, who is a Jewish writer, a Hellenistic Jewish writer down in Alexandria, Egypt, whose life overlapped with that of Jesus. He uses this term for God. So that brings up the question then, does the landowner represent God? And this is a bit debate by commentators. So we won't answer that right away. Also denarius. And this is one thing we have to understand. A denarius actually was not generous. And despite the self-proclamation in the NRSV of the landowner, actually the Greek doesn't even say, in the Greek, it doesn't say that he says he's generous. In the Greek, it said he says, I'm good, not generous. But the NRSV translates it as generous, I think because the translators are had a certain take on the parable. But also in the NRSV, I changed one thing in the translation. I used the NRSV, but when it came to denarius, the NRSV said the daily wage, but the Greek actually says denarius. Now, denarius was thought to be the daily wage, but it wasn't generous. It was the market rate. And as we know, the market rate wage is often not enough. That's why we have minimum wage laws. That's why we often have unions to raise the wage. And because day laborers don't get work every day, this may not have been enough to sustain them. Carol Wilson, in her book, 2012 book, "For I Was Hungry and You Gave Me Food, Pragmatics of Food Access in the Gospel of Matthew," she crunched the numbers and came to the conclusion that in the first century Mediterranean world, in the Roman Empire, 55% of people lived at or below subsistence level. In fact, 25% of them, she says, were definitely below subsistence level. What that means is they didn't have enough to eat. They were essentially starving. So you have to understand that the majority of people were destitute at this time. And this is kind of the context here. A vineyard implies great wealth. This was a cash crop. This wasn't one that people needed. It wasn't the food they needed. The wine was mostly for the elite. It was a luxury good, and it was a cash crop. Also, it required a lot of capital to get it going. It wasn't easy to get going. Only a rich person could do that. Unhired laborers implies an oversupply of labor. So this is all the backdrop here. Also, there's an honor-shame element here. When we are reading the Bible, we're reading texts that come from an honor-shame culture. And this is often, this causes a lot of misunderstanding for modern Westerners, because we are a guilt and innocence culture. So honor shame is more collective, guilt and innocence is more individual. And just to kind of point up how different it is, how cross-cultural it is. There was a guy, what was his name? Joseph Henrich, or I don't know how you pronounce his name. About,
Go ahead.
Oh,
Heinrich.
Yeah, it's Henrich.
Heinrich.
Oh, it's even without the I. It's Heinrich. Okay, so he did a study over 10 years ago. Are you familiar with this study, Bo?
No.
Okay, so he did a study of cultures, and he came up calling our culture. He's an American. He's from the U.S. Weird, which is an acronym for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. But the I could also stand for individualistic. His study also showed that the U.S. in particular is the most individualistic society the world has ever seen. So his point was that we are outliers. We're not like somewhere in the middle, or somewhere, like there's some cultures to one side of us and there's some cultures to the other. And he said, we're way on the edge. We're way fringe. He actually did this as a corrective to the field of psychology, because the way he phrased it is that psychology has been acting as if, it's been using as a baseline American undergraduate students. And so they use that as a baseline for everyone else in the world, right? So he did this study and showed, like, we're using people that are really strange compared to everybody else.
Yeah.
But this is also the case when we're reading the Bible, that we're reading across cultures and we're reading across time. So honor shame is more collective. There's a lot of different ways to understand honor shame versus guilt innocence. One way that I found was very helpful. One scholar said that In a guilt innocent society like ours, conscience resides in the individual. At least that's how we think. Conscience resides in the individual. And in an honor shame society, conscience resides in the community. So that's sort of a way to that's at least the way it's conceptualized and the way it's often acted out. Of course, it's not strict, but so anyway, just knowing that, do you have any idea how would this affect how we understand this parable?
Well, you're talking about the context and the fact that this gave the landowner an opportunity to be charitable in difficult times, to an honor-based society. People who might feel then I go to guilt. Some who might not feel right about taking a full day's pay for not a full day's work, but it gave the landowner the opportunity to give that to them anyhow.
Right.
Based on what you've said about the socioeconomic times.
Right. So, and the way you would apply it is he is actually honoring some people. He's actually extending honor to the ones who weren't hired immediately.
Yes.
Okay. Right. Any other I hadn't thought of that, by the way. Any other ideas?
Does it have something to do? I'm taking that honor shame is applicable to the parable, the players in the parable. So the landowner is considered the honor because he's rich, and the shame is the laborers because they're poor. I mean, we sort of tend to do that nowadays, shame on you, you're poor, and there must be something wrong with the way you live your life, or, that sort of thinking. So I'm just thinking landowner honor, laborer's shame.
Right. So there's probably that dynamic going on. There's so many ways, and we see that in our own culture. You're right. That's not that different from our culture.
Yeah.
But so there's probably the sense in which the wealthy person is honorable and or
good.
Has honor and is good, and the poor don't have honor. There's probably just that basic dynamic. Go ahead, Pam.
Are you talking about our society or
No, the parable?
The parable.
Yeah, in the parable, how does honor shame work in the parable?
Well, I don't know that I would necessarily think that all landowners are honorable. I mean, there are probably quite a few who aren't. But in this parable, this person did provide more compensation to those that came late. And I'm just wondering, for those people that came late, whether they felt any shame in that they worked less than the other people that worked all day in the hot sun, but yet received the same wage. I mean, I don't know if they felt any shame in that perspective.
Yeah.
Well, they're silent in the parable. So that's why they're silent. It's because they were feeling shame.
Yeah. Tom, were you about to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about how not. I mean, I'm extrapolating from our society, 21st century, but the idea of not being a worker is not just something that society shames you for, but I think if you're not employed, people feel a great deal of shame about that, or at least, certain kinds of folks in society. I
Mhm.
was personally unemployed for a while as a result of COVID, and felt a huge amount of shame about, like, I'm not being a productive member of society. I'm not
Right.
doing what I should be doing for the world. And despite that being about forces around me that were, much larger economic forces and social forces that sort of led to that moment, but I could imagine day laborers having similar, in that respect at least, some similar things going on inside their heads in terms of their sense of exclusion from the kind of the dominant, like, economy.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So we can even, just from our own sense of our own psychology and what goes on in our own culture, we can sense some of this. Interestingly, some of the scholarship on this has gone in a little bit different direction with reading Honor Shame, and I like what this group is saying, and I'm going to really think about it and try to take it into account as I write my episode for my podcast on this. The scholarship has focused on the workers grumbled. So the feeling is they felt shamed by the owner, because the owner shamed the ones who he kind of set them up to think they were going to get more, and then paid them the same as the others. And so this is a way of shaming the workers and keeping them divided, because they'll grumble because they feel it was unfair, and it keeps them divided. So that is how a lot of scholarship has looked at it. As I was thinking about this, I was thinking, okay, perhaps the scholars that are saying that have got a point, because the workers did grumble, right? So there's some reason. So in the culture, there's something that they don't like. But I was thinking this, and that is that honor shame is not just about there's a way it works in the parable, but it also affects how the original audience heard the story. Because I wonder if the original audience hearing this, now remember, this is an audience that is more collective, right? So the collective is more important than the individual. And well, I won't say the thing I was about to say, but I'll save that for later. But I wonder if when they're reading the story, they see, perhaps what the scholars are saying, they see that the landowner is trying to divide the workers, but they're disappointed in the workers for falling into it, for falling into the trap, because the workers are acting like individualists and they're not united. Do you remember what the workers' actual complaint was? What was the workers' actual complaint? Does anybody remember?
They came at 5 p.m. and didn't have to work in the heat of the day, so they only worked for an hour. There was no equity in their mind. There was no regard to the work done for the pay received.
Right. There was no equity. You made them equal to us. Their complaint is in verse 12. You have made them equal to us. Their complaint was about equality. It wasn't merely that they wanted to get paid more, because they were hoping. It was that they wanted the others to get paid less.
Right.
See, you hear the difference?
Yes.
Their complaint was about equality. They didn't want to be equal. And I wonder if the original audience would have heard this and been very disappointed, because this was a culture in which unity and the collective was valued. And I think this might be something, depending on who you are today, that we don't always see, because we are so individualistic. And so the scholars, I noticed as I was reading some of the scholarly commentary on this, what I found was I felt like the scholars were falling into the same trap the workers were. Like they were able to see what the landlord is doing, let's say, dividing them, but then they fall into the trap because they agree with the workers, where I think is the original audience might not have agreed with the workers, and they would have been workers themselves, a lot of them, but they might have seen the workers as falling into the trap and acting like individualists and believing and falling for the temptation of meritocracy, which was not a value for them. And I say that because it is a value in our culture. Meritocracy is something that our culture has embraced. And in fact, a lot of scholars, a lot of academics have been very successful in the meritocracy, that higher education is a meritocracy. And so when they read this, they don't see that, and they fall into the same trap. This is what I was thinking today. They fall in the same trap the workers do by dividing, being divided. The workers end up being divided. The scholars tend to agree with them instead of realize that the original audience may have been disappointed in that. Does that make sense?
Yes, totally.
Yeah. So, going forward with some of the content, what let me check the time here. We're supposed to go an hour?
Yeah.
We go about an hour. If you need a couple extra minutes,
okay, all right.
Folks can drop out as they need to, but we try to go about an hour.
Okay, so I want to talk about a little bit about the context in the Gospel of Matthew, the context of this parable. There is a series of parables in the latter part of Matthew where there is a despot. And sometimes it's a king, sometimes it's a house despot or master of the house, or in this case, they translate, NRSV translated as landowner, but it's oikodespotos, or Lord, kurios, what Jesus is called. Actually, Jesus is called all these things. So there's a series of parables in this part of Matthew that are like this one. There was one before this, usually it's called the parable of the unforgiving servant, but I call it the parable of the tyrant king and the unforgiving servant. And in it, at the very end, Jesus says that God will do what the king did to the servant if you don't forgive each other from the heart. And in this one, the king tortures the servant at the end. So it's a parable about forgiveness, but the king doesn't forgive, not the second time at least, and ends up torturing the servant. And each of these parables, they all say the kingdom of heaven is like this. So the kingdom of heaven is like this scenario. And we get a scenario that's very much like the kingdoms of the earth, the kingdoms of this world. So it's really, really interesting. So it's created a problem with commentators on what to do about this. But later in this chapter, what's interesting, and later, right after this, we get this teaching by Jesus. You know that the rulers of the nations lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. It will not be so among you, but whoever is first shall be last. Whoever wishes to be great among you, wait, I just got lost. It will not be so among you, but whoever wishes to be great among you must be your servant. Whoever wishes to be first among you must be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. So here Jesus talks about the great reversal, which is the leveler of society. This is a teaching, a hyper-egalitarian teaching, where he uses the great reversal, the greatest are the least, which we see in our parable. So in the straightforward teaching, Jesus is very egalitarian. In the parables, we get this story, these stories that look very much like the current prevailing society, hierarchical society, where the person who seems like they might represent God is often a tyrant. In this one, it maybe might not have been so clear, But in one of the other ones, the king will destroy a city because people didn't come to his party. You know, so I was wondering if this really has. I'm not sure what to do with this. So I was wondering if maybe people here had some insight into that. What do you how do you reconcile this?
Well, there's a whole other component to this that we haven't really touched on,
Mhm.
I think, and that's on the part of the workers who were there from the beginning, who worked all day. They seem to begrudge what's essentially good fortune of the workers who came last.
Right.
So, I mean, it seems like that's something that we haven't really touched on, is that why would you begrudge someone when you received what you bargained for, what you agreed to? Why would you begrudge the good fortune, for lack of a better term, of those who got a better deal than you did?
That's the wedge, isn't it?
Right.
Well, yeah, that's so some scholars believe that that's the wedge that was being driven between them. And I was suggesting that is I mean, what Bo's saying here is precisely why the original audience might have been disappointed in their fellow workers. And one of the things that constantly comes up in this group of parables where there is a despot is that usually the protagonist is a worker, a servant, a slave, or a group of workers, and they always seem to have failed. Like you have the servant that was forgiven at first, but then he goes on to beat another servant, right? So he was like the protagonist in this parable, but failed to take the opportunity to forgive someone who is in debt to him. And later we'll have the same sorts of things going on in these parables, that the protagonist keeps failing until the very last one. But that's for another time. I think these series of parables does end with one in which the protagonist does not fail, but it's commonly understood that he fails. Anyway, let's move on from here because we don't have a lot of time, unless someone had something that was burning in them to say.
Oh, I wanted to just add a couple
Okay.
quick notes.
Okay.
One of them is that with the word day laborer, right? We talk about day laborers. Jesus himself, the word tekton in Greek, which is often translated carpenter, could refer to a wide range of people who worked with wood, and it could, among other usages, refer to day laborers. So day laborers who would have been working with wood. So Jesus actually might have an obvious resonance with the workers in the parable as much as he might with the landowner. And I just wanted to observe that you talked about the context here with Matthew, what comes after. What comes immediately before this in Matthew 19 is the rich young ruler and the famous saying that it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. So there's a lot of talk about economics and power happening on both sides of this parable. Is what I wanted to offer.
Yeah, and I think that comes next on my but it won't work anymore.
Didn't mean to steal your thunder. Sorry about that.
No, it's fine. That's fine. I'm just thinking for some reason, my PowerPoint stopped working. I'm going to stop share and then reshare.
Sure.
Okay. Because I think it just, for some reason, it's showing the first one. Oh, no. What? Oh, yeah. I see what's going on here.
Scroll us down.
Yeah. I think. This thing is okay. Slideshow from current slide. Okay, that's where we were, right?
Yep.
Okay, so answer my own question, and I'll get right back to what Tom was saying in a minute. It wasn't on the next slide. I now realize there's this slide. I wonder, my theory is that these are clever parables of struggle and warning. And I'm wondering that the reason the parables have these despots and protagonists that fail is that, could this mean that God only works through us? What we do is what the kingdom of heaven ends up being. Because it's called, this is about the kingdom of heaven is here on, we pray for it to be here on earth as it is in heaven, right? For the kingdom to come here on earth as it is in heaven. So it's supposed to be an earth. It's not just a heavenly thing, it's an earthly thing. So right now, all we have is these scenarios reflected in the parables, and everything will continue in that direction unless we change course. And the kingdom or new society is represented in the worker, servant, slaves of the parables. And unless we choose to take the opportunities that arise in the parables to do things differently, the new society will be just like the old. Anyway, I don't know if that makes sense to you, but that's kind of how I'm wrestling with what these parables are like. Because when you really look at these parables, there is this difficulty in how to interpret them, and scholars and commentators have really struggled with this. But let me go on, because I want to. It's doing it again. I think every time I move this thing around, I move the bar around, I think it stops my PowerPoint from working.
Oh no.
Now let me do this again. I'll try not to move it around.
While you do that, I'll just observe that one of the big themes of the series we've been doing is about how the parables don't just admit of one interpretation, and in fact are meant to be challenging. So the fact that we're struggling to make sense of them is actually they're working as intended. That's not a bug, that's a feature.
Right. Okay. Current slide. Let me see. So context. Okay, this is what Tom was getting at. So this parable comes after the rich young man. And that's the story that Tom mentioned. The man comes to Jesus, asks, what must I do to inherit eternal life or to have eternal life? And Jesus ends up telling him to sell everything he has and give the money to the poor. The man can't do that. Jesus turns to his disciples and says, it's really hard for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven. In fact, it's so hard. It's like a camel going through the eye of a needle. So there's several things that tie in with our parable. One is that the rich man can't enter the kingdom of heaven. And here he immediately tells a parable with a rich man with a rich man in it, where he's just in a straightforward teaching, and we're struggling with, is the rich man a stand-in for God? But in the straightforward teaching just before this, in the story that happened, he said that rich people can't, or it's very difficult for them to enter the kingdom of heaven. Also in that passage, he talked about pooled resources. So he says at the very end, those who have left everything to be part of this movement will receive 100-fold fields and houses and brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers and children. They'll get a whole new family that pools their resources. And we see this in the first chapters of Acts, where the early church pools their resources. And that kind of contrasts with our parable, where the workers are not united, where they are divided against each other. So then you get also the great reversal at the very end of that, the story of the rich young man. The last thing Jesus says is, many who are first will be last, and the last first. That gets repeated at the end of our parable, but also is in the parable itself, right? Because the workers who get hired last get paid first. The workers who are hired first get paid last. So it's right in the parable. So there's all these tie-ins right here. So I did want to look at meritocracy. because I do believe that this parable is challenging meritocracy, the idea of meritocracy, and that is something that is very embraced in our culture, and wasn't necessarily embraced by them. So why would it be challenging something that wasn't embraced? But first, I want to kind of just run. Well, here's the definition from dictionary.com of meritocracy. It's a political system in which economic goods and or political power are vested in individual people on the basis of talent, effort, and achievement, rather than wealth or social class. And you can see the picture here. Somebody drew a picture of meritocracy, and it's got three different people. And you notice the three different places they're in, right? One guy is headed for the ladders of, to climb the ladders of meritocracy. Another one's got a ladder, but it's in a completely different place. He's not going to get there, right? And they got another guy who's skipping the ladders altogether. He's floating up with balloons. So this tells you what the person who made this image thinks of meritocracy. So I want to quote from this article by, who's the guy's name?
Did we lose you, Bert?
I think he's frozen.
I think he's frozen.
And I'll just take the opportunity to say, I thought I was saying Heinrich. I was thinking it was with the I. I wasn't looking at it written. So I spoke out of turn on that. I actually, it's probably Henrik. I don't.
Oh,
There.
there. Okay, he's back.
He's back.
He's back.
He's back.
Boy, we love technology until we don't, right, Bert?
Right. I'm telling you, this is giving me a fit tonight. Okay. All right. Back
on
over here.
deck.
Yeah, meritocracy, current slide. All right. So did I finish this before I went out, or
No, you hadn't read us the quote yet. Give it to us.
Okay, so meritocracy has become a leading social ideal. Politicians across the ideological spectrum continually return to the theme that the rewards of life, money, power, and jobs, university admission, should be distributed according to skill and effort. Under meritocracy, wealth and advantage are merit's rightful compensation, not the fortuitous windfall of external events. So that's kind of a good summation of meritocracy, that wealth and advantage are merit's rightful compensation, not for the fortuitous windfall of external events, not just luck. That's kind of the way our society views things. And he says that most people don't just think that the world should be run meritocratically, they think it is meritocratic. So there's two questions here. Should it be? And is it? And those are two questions that should be explored. And he says, although widely held, the belief that merit rather than luck determines success or failure in the world is demonstrably false. This is not least because merit itself is in large part the result of luck. Talent and the capacity for determined effort, sometimes called grit, depend a great deal on one's genetic endowments and upbringing. This is to say nothing of the fortuitous circumstances that figure into every success story. So here he is saying that that not only luck after one is born plays into it, but even where one is born,
Right.
how one is born, where they're raised in. I mean, even if you were to take away the obvious things that we always talk about, like race, color of skin, gender, wealth, the wealth you're born into, but just how you were nurtured, no matter where you are, your genetic endowments, all this stuff you have no control over, and yet that's what determines it. He says, in addition to being false, a growing body of research in psychology and neuroscience suggests that believing in meritocracy makes people more selfish, less self-critical, and even more prone to acting in discriminatory ways. Meritocracy is not only wrong, it's bad. He talks about this game that's played in labs. The ultimatum game is an experiment common in psychological labs in which one player, the proposer, is given a sum of money, told to propose a division between him and another player, the responder, who may accept the offer or reject it. If the responder rejects the offer, neither player gets anything. The experiment has been replicated thousands of times, and usually the proposer offers a relatively even split. If the amount to be shared is $100, most offers fall between $40 and $50. One variation on this game shows that believing one is more skilled leads to more selfish behavior. In research at Beijing Normal University, participants played a fake game of skill before making offers in the ultimatum game. Players who were falsely led to believe that they had won claimed more for themselves than those who did not play the skill game. Other studies confirm this finding. And yes, because I've heard this and I've seen this in other places, that this has been replicated over and over again. And I think Beijing Normal University is in Beijing, right? This was done by some people at Berkeley with, liberal Western Berkeley students. Same thing. When people were deluded into thinking that skills won them things, they began to act differently. If you make people believe, just think that they're poor in a lab, they act one way. You make them think they're rich in a lab, they act a different way. Right. This has been repeated over and over again.
Right.
So now the question is, like, this has been embraced in our culture. So this parable can be very prophetic for our culture. What about for the first century world? Was it prophetic for them? Because they didn't necessarily embrace meritocracy. In fact, my hypothesis is that the original audience might have been disappointed in those workers because they embraced meritocracy. And why, if meritocracy wasn't a thing back then? But I think actually it was. And I think what has happened is that there are many that the temptation to meritocracy is always present, and a lot of cultures have resisted it. Ours has embraced it. And so one I wanted to show you, and I'm just kind of running through this because we're pressed for time here, is the Kung people. This is a traditional hunter-gatherer group in Africa, and they have been noted for their egalitarian ways. And they have this ritual that works against meritocracy when it comes to hunting and killing meat. So they're called the Kung, or the Johannesi, I think is how you say it. I can't really pronounce it. It's a clicking language. So, but they have rituals to prevent arrogance among male hunters. When a man kills an animal, he does not take it directly into the settlement, but leaves the body and returns as if he was successful. An older man will inquire about his hunt and remark upon his failure, to which the hunter must avoid credit and accept humility. The next day, a group will go see if some small animal was nicked by an arrow. Upon finding the animal, the hunter will be reassured of the little value of the kill, which is finally returned. Additionally, the kill may not belong to him, but to the person who gave him arrows, man or woman, who then follows rules on how to distribute the meat to everyone in the group. You see how this hunter-gatherer group has created this very sophisticated ritual to avoid meritocracy. So it's interesting. And I think you can find this across many cultures. And we find this in the Bible, in the manna story. So a lot of times we just read the manna story as as just a parable about God feeding God's people, right? What was that? But read this part of it. It says, "This is what the Lord commanded. Gather as much as each of you needs, an omer to a person according to the number of persons, all providing for those in their own tents." The Israelites did so, some gathering more, some less. But when they measured it with an omer, those who gathered much had nothing over. Those who gathered little had no shortage. They gathered as much as each of them needed. They were provided according to need. So those who got out and hustled early and faster, when it was measured, they just had what they needed, didn't have any more. Those who were a little slower, maybe slept in a little bit, when it was measured, they had what they needed, right? So this is an ancient story that talks about how people should be provided for according to need. And then we get it also in various places in the New Testament, but most famously in Acts, the first chapters of Acts. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. And then in chapter 4, it sort of says the same sort of thing. Now the whole group of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and no one claimed private ownership of any possessions, but everything they owned was held in common. There was not a needy person among them, for as many as owned lands or houses sold them and brought the proceeds of what was sold. They laid it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to each as they had need. So we find this, and in fact, it's a similar sentiment in the rich man's story right before our parable, where all things are held in common and everybody gets 100-fold, houses and fields and brothers and sisters, and So I think that this parable that we're looking at today was in this tradition to talk about how we need to resist meritocracy and resist that kind of division among us. Anyway, okay. So sorry, I've kept you over at 8:11. Are there any thoughts before we go? Any thoughts, questions? You can disagree with this. This is fine. This is just my working hypothesis.
Well, Bert, I don't know that you would have known that I preached on manna in the wilderness 2 days ago. So the pump was primed, as it were. We'll have to play with that metaphor some more. I'll have my sign up sheets for the Communist Party USA in the lobby.
Yeah, Mark was actually, this is Marx. This is often attributed to Marx, but he was pretty late on the scene saying this. This is said way before him.
Yeah.
And he was Jewish. He may have been influenced by the manna story. I don't know.
Marx's father or grandfather was a rabbi. But we don't have time to get into the biography and philosophy of Karl Marx tonight. That's another session.
Thank you,
for one,
Conrad.
really appreciate. I for one really appreciate all the stuff you brought tonight, Bert. There's enough there to, I think, make several episodes of a podcast.
Yeah.
Really? Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
thank you.
Well, thanks for having me. I did. It was packed. Sorry about that.
And before we go, I want to make sure people get the link to your podcast. Just drop that in the chat, subversivewisdom.com. So if you like what you heard, there are 40 episodes of it out already, Bert? Something like that?
50.
Oh.
50.
So,
yeah. So this one, you're helping me with number 51.
It was really thought-provoking. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Bo. Thanks for everyone for letting me do this and coming and all your insights. This really does help me. I really appreciated that you guys went in a different direction than the scholars did, because I was like, wow, you could apply this honor shame thing in different ways.
Yeah.
And I was also thinking that with the whole caste awareness thing, I was wondering if my perception of the parable might not have been colored by my white privilege. Saying, who cares if you came late and didn't work as hard, anyhow.
But doesn't our white privilege usually go the other way? We usually blame people. Say you came late, you don't get so I think I don't know.
Where I was going was that those who didn't work as hard, those who showed up late, they got the advantage. Whereas I think with white privilege, I think that's often the case.
Oh, okay. Right.
So anyhow, that's where I was going. Sorry.
Right.
Privilege is a great example of the myth of meritocracy in action, right?
Yeah.
So,
Really? Yeah.
Well, I don't want to keep folks either. So thank you for being here tonight. And thanks again to Bert for being here and sharing his wisdom. I will have to redux this. We do an in-person version of this class on Sunday mornings before worship, so I'll have to get as much of the good stuff as I can for the that version. But we're glad you were here tonight.
Thank you, Bert.
Honored to be here.
Thank you very much, Bert.
Very
And so-
interesting.
And say hello to Adriana. Tell her I missed her. I hope she's doing well.
Yeah, I missed her too. So we sure will. Well, hey, you
All
folks
right.
have a good night.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
I thank you again.